I've always been the kind of person who keeps things together. When the dishwasher breaks, I fix it. When someone forgets a birthday, I cover. When my mom needs a ride to the doctor at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, I'm the one in the driveway before she's even had her coffee. That's just who I am. Or at least that's who I thought I was. The one who showed up. So when the doctors told me I needed surgery, I think part of me expected my family to show up too. Not because I demanded it. Not because I announced it like some kind of test. But because that's what you do. That's what I had always done. I was 31 years old. I'd been ignoring the pain in my abdomen for months. The way you do when you're busy and uninsured, and just hoping things will work themselves out. By the time I finally saw a doctor, it wasn't optional anymore. I had a large ovarian cyst that had partially twisted, and my surgeon said if I waited much longer, I could lose the ovary entirely. The procedure was scheduled for March 14th. Outpatient surgery, yes, but still. General anesthesia. A recovery period of at least 2 to 3 weeks where I wouldn't be able to drive, lift anything heavier than a gallon of milk, or really do much of anything on my own. The problem was that March 14th fell right in the middle of my family's trip to Cancun. My parents and my younger brother had booked it back in November. A week, at an all-inclusive resort, one of those places awesome with the cis bar and the nightly entertainment, and the buffet that goes on forever. They'd been planning it for months. My brother had just gotten a promotion at work. My parents wanted to celebrate. I understood. I genuinely did. But here's the thing. I didn't choose the date. My surgeon had an opening, and given what was happening inside my body, she strongly recommended I not push it further than a week or two out. I told my mom this. I told her the exact words my doctor used. I thought she would understand. She did not cancel the trip. She told me she was sorry, that the timing was terrible, that they had already paid for everything, and that the resort had a no-refund policy within 30 days. She said it would only be a week. She said I'd probably be back on my feet by the time they landed. She said my aunt lived 40 minutes away and could check in on me. My aunt did not check in on me. The day of my surgery, I drove myself to the hospital. I parked my car in the long-term garage, walked to the registration desks, and gave them my name. The woman behind the counter asked me if I had someone who could drive me home afterward. I told her yes. I had already arranged for a ride share. She looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, and I looked back at her, and neither of us said anything else. I was in pre-op for about an hour before they took me back. I remember lying there in that thin hospital gown, staring up at the ceiling tiles, counting them. 22. I know that number because I counted them 3 times. I had my phone in my hand and I kept looking at it, not because I expected a call, but because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. My dad texted at 7:43 in the morning. It said, "Hope it goes well, kiddo. Keep us posted." That was it. That was the whole message. I put my phone face down on the bed and stared at the ceiling again. The surgery lasted about 90 minutes. When I woke up in recovery, my throat hurt from the intubation and my eyes kept watering for no reason I could explain. A nurse named Linda held my hand for a few minutes and told me everything had gone well. She asked if there was anyone in the waiting room for me. There was not. I called the rideshare from the discharge area. I sat in a wheelchair by the hospital entrance with a plastic bag of paperwork in my lap, and I waited. An older gentleman sitting nearby, he must have been in his late 70s, maybe early 80s, glanced over at me a couple of times. He had silver hair and a hearing aid in his left ear, and the kind of posture that tells you he used to be someone who stood very straight. He was waiting for someone too, I assumed. After a few minutes he said quietly, "You doing okay, young lady?" I told him I was fine. I'd just had a small procedure. He nodded and said, "Is someone coming for you?" I said yes. My driver was 4 minutes away. He nodded again and didn't push it, but he stayed. He sat there until my car pulled up, and when the driver helped me get in, the old man stood and raised a hand and said, "Feel better now," like he meant it. Like it actually mattered to him whether a stranger at a hospital entrance felt better. I thought about him the whole ride home. My recovery was harder than I expected. The first 3 days were the worst. I couldn't get comfortable no matter what position I tried. The pain medication made me nauseous, and the nausea made it impossible to eat, and not eating made everything else worse. I had a follow-up appointment 5 days after surgery that I wasn't sure I could get to. My family had been in Cancun for 2 days by then. My mom sent photos. Not intentionally cruel. I think just the kind of thing you do when you're on vacation and you're happy. A picture of the beach at sunset. A picture of my dad holding a frozen drink and grinning. My brother with his arm around some other resort guest, both of them laughing at something. I looked at each photo for a long time. I wasn't angry at first. I was something else. Hollowed out, maybe. Like watching someone eat through a window when you're hungry. I texted back things like looks amazing and so jealous because I didn't know what else to say, and I didn't want to ruin their trip. I wasn't going to be that person. I was going to be fine. I was not fine. On day 4, I couldn't get off the couch by myself. My incision sites were aching and I'd run out of the prescription anti-nausea medication, and I couldn't drive to the pharmacy. I called my mom. She didn't pick up. I texted her. She responded 40 minutes later with, "Sorry honey, we're at the beach. Can your neighbor help?" My neighbor was an 80-year-old woman who walked with a cane. I called the pharmacy and begged them to deliver. They did eventually for a $15 delivery fee I could barely afford. I sat on the kitchen floor for a while after I hung up the phone. Not crying exactly. Just sitting there. What I didn't know then was that someone had been paying attention the whole time. My great-uncle Edwin is my grandmother's brother. He's 83 years old, lives 20 minutes from me, and drives a 12-year-old Buick that he insists still runs perfectly, despite all evidence to the contrary. He's not someone I'd describe as warm exactly, more like steady, deliberate, the kind of man who says very little but means every word. He was a machinist for 35 years. He keeps a small notebook in his shirt pocket. He calls me sweetheart, but only when he really means it. Uncle Edwin had found out about my surgery from my grandmother, who had found out from my mom. He called me the morning of my procedure, before I went in, and I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number, and I was nervous and distracted. "I heard you're having surgery today," he said. I told him yes, it was just a small thing. "Is anyone going with you?" I paused. I told him I had it figured out. He said, "I'll be there in an hour." I told him he didn't have to do that. He said, "I know I don't have to." And then he hung up. He was there in 45 minutes. He sat in the waiting room the entire time I was in surgery. He was the one waiting when they wheeled me out. He drove me home in that Buick with the cracked dashboard and the NPR station he always has on, and he didn't try to make conversation, which was exactly right. When we got to my apartment, he walked me inside and made sure I had water and my medication and a blanket within reach, and then he asked if he could come back tomorrow. I said he didn't have to. He said, "I know I don't have to." He came back every day for the next 10 days. He drove me to my 5-day follow-up. He picked up my prescriptions. He brought soup, not from a can, actual soup, the kind his late wife used to make with the egg noodles and the dill. And he sat at my kitchen table while I ate it, reading his newspaper, not talking. Some days that silence was the most comforting thing in the world. He never once said anything negative about my family, never once suggested I should be angry. But I noticed that every time I mentioned something, like how my mom had called finally, and complained that the international roaming charges were adding up, or how my brother hadn't texted at all since day 1. Uncle Edwin would take out his little notebook and write something down. I assumed he was making grocery lists or keeping track of appointments. I didn't think much of it. My family came home on a Saturday. I'd been recovering for 11 days by then. I was getting around better, but I was still slow, still tired in a way that got into my bones. I'd lost 7 pounds because eating had been so hard in the beginning. My mom called me from the airport. She sounded tan. If that makes sense, happy and loose the way you are when you've been somewhere warm and you're not quite ready to be back. She said they'd had an incredible time. She said my dad had gotten a little sunburned, but it was worth it. She said she couldn't wait to show me the pictures. She asked how I was feeling. I said I was doing okay. She said, good, we'll have to get together soon. Not that week. Soon unspecified. My brother texted a day later, "Hey, you all good?" I said yes. He sent a thumbs up. That was the full extent of my family's post-surgery check-in. Uncle Edwin noticed this too. He'd been there on the Saturday they came home. He'd come over to help me with some laundry I couldn't manage yet, and I'd mentioned my mom had called from the airport, and he'd written something in his notebook. I finally asked him what he was writing. He looked at me over his reading glasses for a moment. Then he said, "Just keeping track." "Of what?" "Of things," he said. "In case it ever matters." I didn't push it. The weeks after my family returned were their own particular kind of hard, not dramatic, nothing you could point to and say, "There, that's the thing." It was more like a series of small absences stacking up on each other. My mom never asked how the surgery had gone, not what the doctor found, not what the recovery had been like, not whether I was scared. She'd moved on from it the way you move on from a minor inconvenience, acknowledged, set aside, forgotten. One Sunday she called me to talk for 45 minutes about my cousin's engagement and the venue they were considering. And I sat there on my couch and listened and said, "Oh wow, and that's so exciting, and have they set a date yet?" And not once did she ask how my incision was healing. I mentioned to my dad once that I'd had some trouble eating in the first week. He said, "Yeah, anesthesia does that," and changed the subject to something he'd seen on television. My brother came over once 3 weeks after the surgery. He stayed for maybe 30 minutes. He ate most of the chips I had on the counter, drank 2 of my sodas, and spent most of the visit telling me about a work trip he was planning to Denver. When he left, he said, "Good to see you looking better." As though I had done something to myself that I was now recovering from. Meanwhile, Uncle Edwin had driven me to 2 follow-up appointments, helped me reorganize my kitchen so things were easier to reach, fixed the leaking faucet in my bathroom that I'd been putting off for months, and brought me a plant, a small pothos in a blue ceramic pot, because, he said, it would be good for me to take care of something that needed taking care of. He was right, it was. My parents' 40th anniversary was in June. They were throwing a party, not a small family dinner, but an actual party at a banquet hall they'd rented in their town with catering and a DJ and centerpieces my mom had been planning since February. They'd invited about 90 people, family, old friends, neighbors, people from their church, the whole production. I was expected to be there, of course. Expected to smile and circulate and tell people how proud I was and how wonderful my parents were, and I went back and forth for weeks about whether I could do it. Not because I didn't love them, but because something had shifted in me since March, and I hadn't figured out yet what to do with the shift. Uncle Edwin was coming too. He drove me, actually, because my car was in the shop that weekend. A coincidence with genuinely terrible timing that somehow felt appropriate. The banquet hall was decorated beautifully, I'll give them that. String lights and white tablecloths and a slideshow playing on a screen near the entrance. Pictures of my parents through the years. There was one from their honeymoon, one from when my brother was born, one from a family vacation when I was about 8, all of us squinting into the sun somewhere in the Smoky Mountains. I looked at that photo for a long time. The dinner went the way these things go. Too much food, not enough seats initially, my dad's old college friends telling stories that ran too long, my aunt getting teary during the toast. My mom was radiant, the way she gets when she's the center of something. My brother was at a table near the front with his girlfriend and some people I didn't know. Uncle Edwin sat with me at a table toward the middle. He ate slowly, he barely touched his wine. He seemed like he was thinking about something, but when I asked, he just said, "I'm fine, sweetheart." The program portion of the evening started around 9. There was a slideshow narrated by my dad, then a toast from my brother, which was charming and mostly about himself, which made everyone laugh. Then some open remarks from family members who wanted to share memories. At some point, my uncle stood up. I didn't know he was going to do this, he hadn't told me. He walked to the front of the room and my dad handed him the microphone. And everyone sort of quieted down because Uncle Edwin is not a man who stands up to speak very often. When he does, people listen. He thanked my parents for the invitation. He said 40 years was something worth celebrating, and that he meant that sincerely. He said he'd watched their family grow from the very beginning, and that he'd seen a lot of things over the years. He paused here. One of those deliberate Edwin pauses that feels like it has weight to it. Then he said he wanted to share something. Because he believed that families should be honest with each other, and that honesty was the only thing that made love real, instead of just convenient. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his small notebook. The room was very quiet now. He said that back in March his great-niece, me, had surgery. That I had driven myself to the hospital, sat in pre-op alone, and been discharged with a rideshare. He said that while I was recovering, he had come every day, and that during those days I had received the following from my parents and brother, a 7-word text on the morning of surgery, a photo from the resort, one brief call from the airport 11 days later. He read the dates. He read the times. He had written all of it down. He read my mom's text about roaming charges. He read my brother's thumbs up. He said he wasn't reading these things to shame anyone. He said he was reading them because he loved this family, and because he had watched one member of it show up alone to something terrifying, and he thought the family deserved to know what that looked like from the outside. The room was so quiet, I could hear the DJ's equipment humming across the hall. My mom's face had gone very still. My dad was looking at the tablecloth. My brother had his arms crossed and was staring at the floor. Someone at a table near the back said quietly, "Oh my goodness." Uncle Edwin closed his notebook. He said that he was proud of me, that I had recovered with grace and without asking for anything, and that I deserved to be told that out loud, in front of people who loved me. Then he put the notebook back in his pocket and he handed the microphone back to my dad, and he walked back to our table and sat down and picked up his fork. For a long moment, nobody in the room said anything at all. The aftermath was what you'd expect and also nothing like what I expected. My mom cried. Not immediately. First she sat very still, then she excused herself to the restroom, and then she cried, and my aunt went with her. My dad came over to our table and sat down across from Uncle Edwin and said very quietly, "Edwin, you didn't have to do that tonight." And Uncle Edwin said, just as quietly, "I know I didn't have to." My dad looked at him for a long moment and then he looked at me and his eyes were red and he said, "I'm sorry, sweetheart." It was the first time he'd called me that. The word sounded different coming from him. My brother came over eventually. He didn't say much at first. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor, and then he said, "I didn't realize." I didn't say anything back, because I didn't know what response would be honest and kind at the same time, and I decided I only wanted to say things that were both. The party sort of reconstituted itself after a while, the way parties do. People got more drinks. The DJ started playing again. My parents' friends came over one by one and hugged them and said things I couldn't hear. A few people came over to me, people I barely knew, older women mostly, who squeezed my hand and said things like "You're stronger than you know," and "Family is complicated, baby, it just is." One woman, someone from my parents' church, leaned down and said to me, "That man loves you something fierce." She nodded toward Uncle Edwin, who was eating his cake and pretending not to notice all the attention. I looked at him. He had come to that hospital without being asked. He had sat in a waiting room for 90 minutes for me. He had brought soup and driven me to appointments and fixed my faucet and brought me a plant and written everything down in that little notebook. Not out of anger, not to build a case, but because he was paying attention, and paying attention was how he loved people. In the parking lot afterward, walking to his Buick, I took his arm, he let me. We walked slowly because I was still a little tired. Residual, the doctor said, completely normal. And the night air was warm and smelled like someone nearby was grilling late. And the string lights from the banquet hall spilled out through the windows in long golden lines across the pavement. I told him I hadn't known he was going to do that. He said, "I know." I asked him when he'd decided. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "The day I picked you up from the hospital, you had that little bag in your lap, and you were trying so hard not to look like you needed anything." And I thought, somebody needs to remember this. I didn't say anything for a while. We got to the car and he unlocked it, and I got in slowly, carefully, and he waited until I was settled before he closed the door. On the drive home, he had the radio on low. Some old jazz station he liked, the kind with no DJ, just music. I looked out the window at the streetlights going by, and I thought about what it means to actually be seen by someone, not performed for, not managed or placated or sent a text so they can say they checked in. Actually seen. The kind of scene where someone notices what's happening to you, even when you're trying not to make a big deal out of it. I had spent so long being the person who held things together for everyone else that I had convinced myself I didn't need anyone to hold things together for me. That needing was a kind of weakness. That asking was a burden. That the right thing to do was to call my rideshare and count the ceiling tiles and tell the nurse I was fine. I was not fine, but I was now. Or I was getting there. Which is maybe the same thing, at a certain distance. When we pulled up to my apartment, Uncle Edwin turned off the engine, and we sat there for a moment without moving. The pothos he'd given me was visible in my window, green and trailing over the edge of the shelf, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. He looked at it too, then he said, "Good. You remembered to water it." I laughed. It came out a little watery, which I think we both pretended not to notice. "You doing okay?" he asked, the same question the stranger at the hospital had asked me months ago. But from Edwin it landed differently. It landed like something he actually needed the answer to. I told him yes, that I was doing okay. He nodded the way he does when he believes something. "Good," he said. "You've got people." I squeezed his hand. He squeezed back once, firm and brief, the way men of his generation do when they mean something they can't quite say out loud. I got out of the car and walked up to my door, and I heard him wait until I was inside before he started the engine again. I stood in my entryway for a moment in the quiet of my own apartment, and I thought about all the things I had carried alone and all the things I hadn't needed to. Some of my family had failed me in March. That was true, and it was going to take time to figure out what to do with that truth. But some of my family had also shown up so completely, so quietly, so without needing to be asked, that I hadn't even fully understood it until an old man stood in a banquet hall in June and read from a notebook, not to cause pain, but because he thought I deserved to be seen. He was right, I deserved to be seen. And somewhere between that hospital ceiling and that parking lot, and that pothos growing green in my window. I had finally started to believe it.